Hi, my name's not on the will, not the way they wanted it. Right after my grandfather was buried, before the flowers had even wilted, my father turned to me and said, "You'll get nothing. All 48 million to my brother." My mother, she stood there, like silence was a favor. But then the lawyer said, "There's one more thing," and pointed to a screen. "Your grandfather left a video," he said. And suddenly, I understood why my father looked afraid. Now tell me, what kind of truth needs to be hidden behind a funeral? The last handfuls of dirt had just been tossed over the polished mahogany casket, the final prayers still hanging in the cold, gray air. I didn't move when everyone else took a step back. I stood there, hands in my coat pockets, feeling the Texas soil damp beneath my shoes. The wind slid past my ears in silence. It smelled faintly of cedar and old earth. The kind of air that makes your skin remember pain you haven't processed yet. I looked down at the watch on my wrist. His watch. The one he always wore, even when fixing fence posts or wiping grease off his hands after working on the old Chevy. I adjusted it out of habit. The leather strap had cracked in places, but I couldn't let it go. It was one of the last things of his that still ticked. I didn't cry. I hadn't in years. Somewhere along the way, tears stopped making sense. A few feet behind me, I heard the subtle shift of bodies, suits brushing, heels on gravel. The family was regrouping like clockwork. From mourning to motion, I knew this pattern. Grief in our house always had a time limit, a small window before the real agenda showed up. I turned slowly, just enough to see them. My father, rigid as always, arms crossed. My mother, hands clasped, staring at the horizon. My older brother, Daniel, was already pulling out his phone, probably texting his wife that it was over. Not the funeral, the show. He'd worn the most expensive coat at the burial, like he was posing for the cover of a Southern lifestyle magazine. No one spoke to me. That wasn't new. I walked closer, keeping a bit of distance. It wasn't that I wanted to join them. I just didn't want to be left behind again. Then, like someone flipping a switch, my father's voice cut through the stillness. "You'll get nothing. All 48 million goes to your brother." He said it like he was commenting on the weather, like I'd asked and he was just being honest. There was no anger in his voice, not even disappointment, just finality. The kind of sentence you don't argue with because it was never open for discussion in the first place. For a second, I wasn't sure I'd heard him right, but the tightness in my chest said otherwise. My hearing dimmed, like I ducked underwater. The wind, the shuffling shoes, the hushed murmurs, all gone. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? It wasn't about the money. God knows, I'd never planned on that inheritance. What stung was the ease of it. The way he stripped me of any place in this family with a single sentence in front of cousins, old friends, even the pastor, like I'd never belonged to begin with. I caught a glimpse of Aunt Linda's reaction, eyes wide, then quickly darting away. Uncle Ray tightened his jaw but said nothing. That was the thing about my family. They were masters of pretending things were normal. But I wasn't looking for their sympathy. I turned to my mother. She didn't meet my eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't whisper, "That's not fair," or even place a hand on my arm. Nothing. She just stared past me, lips pressed together like stone. Her silence hit harder than his words. At least my father had spoken. My mother erased me without opening her mouth. I swallowed hard, still frozen in place. A dozen comebacks clawed at my throat, a lifetime of being the one they forgot. The one who stayed behind to help Grandpa when he got sick. The one who repaired the porch steps, paid the property taxes when no one else did. But I didn't speak. Not here. Not while the dirt was still wet. This wasn't the place. Not yet, I thought. Then came the shift. A new energy. A man I hadn't noticed before stepped forward, adjusting his coat nervously. The lawyer. His name escaped me, but I recognized the leather folder in his hand, the one I'd seen years ago on Grandpa's kitchen table. He cleared his throat. "There's still one more thing," he said, pausing like the next words carried weight he hadn't expected. Everyone turned toward him. Even Daniel lowered his phone. The air tensed again, not with grief this time, but with the strange pull of unfinished business. He cleared his throat and said there was still something my grandfather hadn't let anyone hear yet. I didn't know it then, but that pause was the first crack in everything they thought they controlled. The lawyer held his breath for a second too long, like he was deciding whether to keep going or just walk away. Before he could speak again, I glanced sideways at Daniel. He wasn't confused. No leaning forward to hear better. No furrowed brows. No sidelong glance toward Dad or Mom. Just still. Calm. Like someone watching a movie they'd already seen. It wasn't shock I felt in that moment. It was recognition. This wasn't news to him, and now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The way his hand didn't flinch, still holding that phone. The way his posture didn't change. It was all too steady, too clean. I'd seen Daniel fall apart over less. He already knew. And this had been rehearsed. I didn't say anything. My thoughts started racing in circles, searching for clues I might have missed. There had to have been signs. 3 weeks ago, at Mom's birthday, Daniel made some offhand joke about how some people don't need money to feel important. I remember brushing it off, thinking it was just his usual dig, but now I could hear the edge in his voice. The weight. He hadn't been joking. He'd been preparing. I scanned back further. The time Dad called Daniel the backbone of this family at Thanksgiving. When it was me who stayed with Grandpa through chemo, who drove him to every VA appointment, who filed the paperwork when he couldn't remember how. All of that was slowly being painted over. Now, standing there at the edge of the grave, the lawyer still hadn't moved. Then, my father took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't even look at me. "It wasn't sudden," he said flatly, eyes on the dirt. "Your grandfather made his choice over time. Daniel was the one who stayed the course, the one who understood what the family needed." My jaw clenched. I didn't interrupt. I just let him go on, because something in his tone told me he was about to rewrite everything. "He was the one who helped build this legacy," he added. "He understood responsibility, discipline, what it takes to hold things together when others drift." I knew that was aimed at me, and it wasn't just a lie. It was a performance for the people standing nearby, for the cousins and in-laws and old church friends who'd known just enough to nod but never enough to question. I wasn't just being cut out. I was being edited out. Dad kept going, said Daniel was always the one who showed up when it mattered. I almost laughed. Showed up? I lived 3 miles from Grandpa. Daniel flew in for Christmas and posted selfies. When Grandpa couldn't tie his own shoes, I was there. When he got scared in the middle of the night, I was the one driving over. No one saw those nights. No one wanted to. And now I was being called someone who helped out. That's what my father said. He helped out here and there. Helped out. The word stung harder than any curse. I felt something turn over in my stomach, like I'd swallowed a stone. I kept my face neutral, even as my pulse pounded in my ears. Because this is how families erase you. Not in one blow, but with 1,000 small phrases. With the word just and the phrase nothing personal. With cold smiles and polite shrugs. I looked over at Daniel again. This time, his eyes met mine. Only for a second. Then he looked away. He didn't try to defend me. He didn't say, "That's not true," or "You helped more than I did." He didn't even fake concern. And that silence, his silence, confirmed everything. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, behind my eyes, but I didn't let it show. Not now. Because if I spoke, I'd be the bitter one, the troublemaker, the ungrateful son. No. If I speak now, I lose, I thought. If I watch longer, I learn. So I stood still, chin raised, and I watched them rewrite the past. What hit me hardest wasn't the money. It was that they'd planned this. Not just the decision, but the rollout. The optics. The storytelling. They'd crafted it to make Daniel the hero and me the footnote. And I realized this wasn't about money at all. It was about something deeper. That was when I understood this wasn't about money. It was about rewriting who mattered. And once I saw what they were erasing, I couldn't stop thinking about the years they pretended never happened. I closed the car door gently, the sound hollow against the fading hum of people leaving. The cemetery behind me was quiet now, just a few cars idling in the distance, their headlights starting to blink on against the dusk. I sat for a while without touching the ignition. No music, no phone, just me and the kind of silence that doesn't press in. It lets you breathe. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. I was thinking, letting the weight settle, sorting through what had just happened and everything it tried to bury. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I stared ahead at nothing in particular, just letting my thoughts drift the way they hadn't been allowed to back there. When I was being spoken over, pushed aside, made to vanish, it started coming back in waves. The small, plain details of the years no one mentioned. Like how I used to keep Grandpa's meds organized, 7-day boxes lined up on the counter, morning pills, evening pills, the sticky notes with handwritten reminders, or the folder I carried to every appointment, tucked under my arm like a file clerk on autopilot. His blood pressure logs, notes for the neurologist, VA claim updates. No one asked me to do it. That's what people never understand. I didn't do it because I had to. I did it because he mattered to me. Because he'd been the one who showed up to my baseball games, who told me the truth when I messed up, who handed me a screwdriver and said, "Fix it yourself or you'll never learn." And when he started slipping, forgetting names, dates, simple words, I didn't run from it. I leaned in. Daniel didn't. My parents didn't. They visited, sure, for holidays, for birthdays, but only when it was convenient, only when they could be seen. I remember one Christmas, maybe 4 years ago, Daniel brought his girlfriend, stayed 2 hours, then left early to meet some friends in the city. Grandpa asked about him the rest of the evening. I didn't have the heart to explain. I just made up some excuse about traffic. Then there was Thanksgiving, the one where Dad toasted family and looked Daniel in the eye like he was the one holding everything together. I was sitting 2 seats down, my arm still sore from lifting Grandpa into the tub that morning. But I didn't say anything, because that's what I'd been taught. Don't make things uncomfortable. Don't dwell. Just be there. Quietly. Steady. That was my job, right? And for a long time, I believed someone was paying attention. Turns out no one was. Or worse, maybe they were, and they just decided it didn't count. What made it worse was knowing what I'd put aside, what I'd missed. There was a woman once, Jillian. We'd been talking seriously about moving in together when things with Grandpa got more complicated. She wanted to travel, start her own studio. I said I needed to stay. She said she understood, but understanding only goes so far when your life feels like it's on pause, and someone else's is moving forward without you. I let that go, quietly. I turned down a job in Seattle, a good one. Could have changed things for me, but I couldn't leave him alone, not with strangers. He wouldn't have asked me to stay. That wasn't who he was, but he didn't need to. That was love, right? Quiet, costly, the kind no one writes speeches about. And now, standing there next to his grave, they acted like none of it ever happened. I leaned my head back against the seat. The sky was turning a deep gray, the kind of color that makes you wonder if the day ever really began. Then another memory crept in, one I hadn't thought about until just now. It was a few months ago. My father called me into his study. Nothing formal, just come in here a minute. He was seated behind his desk, glasses low on his nose, that legal pad in front of him like always. There was a document on the table. Just a formality, he said, sliding it across to me. Helps clear up some estate things. I remember the way he said it, too casual, like he'd practiced the line. I picked it up, legal language, a lot of it. I asked what it meant. He waved a hand. Standard stuff, power of attorney, basic releases. But something in me paused. I read it, slowly, asked more questions, and when the answers got vaguer, I put the paper down. I'll need time, I said. He didn't press, didn't smile either. We never spoke of it again. But now, sitting here in the darkening car, I wondered, was that the moment it started? Was that when I stopped being useful? Maybe they expected me to sign without looking. Maybe I was supposed to play along like always. And by not doing that, by simply hesitating, I became a problem. I kept thinking about that document, what was really in it, what it meant, and why, for the first time in my life, I hadn't just gone along with what they said. It was a small thing, but maybe it was enough. I didn't know it then, but refusing to sign that paper was the moment they stopped pretending I belonged. After that day, every conversation felt like it was happening behind a locked door. 2 days had passed since the funeral. The rain never came, but the air had stayed heavy, like something was always just about to fall. I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in, though it didn't feel like mine anymore. It was still spotless, still symmetrical, still quiet in the way that used to feel safe. Now it felt like walking into someone else's life with a key you weren't supposed to still have. I came back to pick up a few personal boxes I'd left behind after staying here the last few months. The arrangement had always been temporary, though no one ever said for how long. Inside, the lighting was soft and deliberate, like always. The furniture hadn't moved. The photos on the wall were still perfectly aligned, but the house didn't feel open anymore. Something in it had changed. Doors were closed that were usually open. The kitchen, once filled with clinking dishes and unsolicited opinions, was now a quiet corner of staged civility. I passed my mother in the hallway. She gave a brief nod. No hug, no words, just a nod, like a neighbor you once knew but couldn't quite place. I went upstairs, avoiding the stairs that creaked. My old room was still untouched, though maybe that was the most telling change. Like they wanted it preserved just enough to say they cared, but not enough to make it real. Down the hall, Daniel's voice trailed through the crack of a door. I couldn't hear what he said, just the sound of confidence. Laughter. Then silence when my footstep landed too close. Conversations paused when I entered rooms now. Eyes darted. Voices softened. I didn't ask anymore. I didn't insert myself. I just watched. There's a strange comfort in finally knowing where you stand. I made my way to the study. No one else was downstairs. My father was out meeting a client. He never retired, not really. My mother was probably folding towels she didn't need to fold. The study looked exactly the same. Walnut desk, old globe in the corner, brass lamp with the green glass shade. The smell of paper and worn leather still lingered, like the room had its own private atmosphere. I stepped in, quietly, and let the door close behind me. This room had once felt like power. Now it felt like layers. I stood behind the desk for a moment. My fingers traced the edge where I used to leave sticky notes as a kid, pretending I had a business of my own. My father had kept the same layout for years. Folders to the left, a silver pen holder dead center, drawer handles polished from use. One of those drawers didn't open. I gave it a gentle tug, then firmer. Locked. It stopped me cold. That drawer had never been locked before. Not in all the years I'd fetched files, dropped off envelopes, watched my father write out Christmas bonus checks with the same black pen. I stared at it for a long time, my hand still resting on the handle. It would have taken 5 seconds to find a flathead screwdriver. I could have opened it without anyone knowing, but I didn't. I stepped back, because now I didn't need the drawer to tell me something was being kept from me. I already knew. What I needed now wasn't drama. It was truth. Quiet, solid, undeniable truth. I took one more look around and turned to leave. Just as I reached for the doorknob, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "Mr. Davis?" a voice said, measured, smooth, clipped at the end like someone used to managing difficult conversations. "Yes?" "This is Stephen Calloway. I'm handling your grandfather's estate." I'd heard the name before, once, briefly. He wasn't the firm my father used. That, suddenly, felt important. "I was hoping to speak with you privately," he continued. "Do you have a moment?" I stepped back into the study, closing the door again. "I do now." There was a pause, longer than necessary. "I wanted to ask," he said carefully. "Have you been shown any documents by your family in recent weeks? Anything presented as related to the estate?" My eyes drifted toward the locked drawer. "No," I said. "Nothing I signed anyway." Another pause. The kind you could feel in your chest. "I see. I understand." His voice grew even more cautious. "I'd like to set up a meeting. In person. Sooner rather than later." "What's this about?" I asked. "I think it's best we speak directly." That answer told me everything and nothing at once. He gave a time and place, downtown, near the courthouse. I scribbled it on the back of a receipt still in my wallet. My hand stayed steady, but inside I could feel something click into place. This wasn't just about who got what. This was about something that had already been decided, hidden, and now was beginning to surface. When he hung up, I understood that the real conversation was about to begin. I walked out of that house knowing silence was no longer protecting anyone. The next morning, the sky over Dallas hung in a dull gray. It wasn't threatening rain, it just looked like it had given up deciding. I arrived at the attorney's office 10 minutes early. Not because I was anxious, I just wanted to be grounded before they walked in. The lobby was all clean lines and muted tones, polished stone floors, recessed lighting, abstract art that didn't say anything. It was the kind of place where voices never rose. The kind of room that didn't care who you were outside its walls. There were no family photos here. No reminders of who used to hold my hand walking into doctor's offices or cheer the loudest at my graduation. Just neutral beige and brushed aluminum. I sat in the waiting area and watched the seconds tick off the wall clock. Each one felt like a shallow breath. At exactly 9:02, the receptionist stood and motioned toward the frosted glass door. "They're ready for you." "They?" I asked. She nodded once. I walked in and stopped just inside the threshold. They were all already seated. My father sat at the far end of the oval table, legs crossed, leaning back like he was waiting for a client. My mother sat 2 chairs down, posture straight, lips pursed like she was holding a secret. Daniel had taken the seat nearest the attorney, elbows off the table, eyes on his folded hands. I took the last empty chair, diagonally across from the lawyer, with no one directly beside me. No one said a word. Stephen Calloway looked like he belonged in a courtroom drama. Trimmed beard, navy suit, a tie that probably cost more than my month's rent. His expression didn't give away anything, which in this room made him the most honest man here. He began, calm, professional, distant. He explained the estate structure, the legal definitions, the timeline of probate. He spoke like it was any other file on his desk, but every sentence felt like it was bending around something heavier. I sat there, listening, but not really hearing. My mind kept circling the space between words, not the words themselves. I'd spent years perfecting patience, letting things slide, giving benefit of the doubt. Now that patience felt like something they'd counted on, like it was a feature of me they'd exploited, not respected. He continued reading. Then he stopped. It wasn't a stumble. It was a deliberate, conscious halt. His eyes remained on the document. The room went still in a way that pressed on your ribs. My father shifted slightly, but didn't speak. My mother's fingers laced tighter. Daniel exhaled through his nose, but kept his gaze down. No one asked why he'd stopped, but I felt it. That this was the moment we'd been circling toward. Not the will, not the shares, not the house. This. I stared at the lawyer, trying not to blink. The silence stretched thin, then thinner. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't hesitation. This was staging. Someone knew what came next. I looked at each of them again, one by one. They weren't confused. They weren't waiting like I was. They were bracing. I almost asked what he wasn't saying. I didn't, because speaking now would shift the balance. I knew better. You don't interrupt a storm you haven't seen the shape of yet. Instead, I leaned back slowly in my chair and kept my face neutral. He glanced up from the folder, adjusted the edge of the paper, then closed it halfway. "There is," he said, "one additional matter that needs to be addressed." He hadn't said what it was yet, but everyone suddenly looked like they already knew. That was the moment I realized patience had turned into a test. The air in the room changed without anyone moving. It wasn't louder or darker. It just tightened, like a belt pulled one notch too far. Stephen Calloway straightened in his chair and adjusted the folder in front of him, not in a nervous way, but with intent. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a different weight. "There is an addendum associated with the will," he said. Slower now. Careful. "It is not financial in nature." My father leaned forward at once. "We've already reviewed all relevant materials," he said, his tone clipped, practiced. "There's no need to complicate things." That word hung there. Complicate. Stephen didn't respond right away. He folded his hands, then unfolded them, as if choosing the right version of the truth. The addendum, he continued, is a recorded statement made by your father prior to his passing. A video. I didn't react, not outwardly. Inside, something settled, not relief, not victory, just certainty, the kind you feel when a puzzle piece clicks into place and you realize it was never lost. It was hidden. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the table. He didn't ask what the recording contained. He didn't look surprised. That told me more than any denial could have. My mother didn't move at all. My father shook his head once. That recording isn't relevant, he said. It was made during a difficult period. My father wasn't well. He was well enough to plan his estate, Stephen replied evenly. That doesn't mean he was thinking clearly, my father shot back. We discussed this. The video was never meant to be played, Stephen finished. Silence again. Thicker this time. I could hear my own breathing. I focused on keeping it steady. This wasn't the moment for emotion. This was the moment for memory. Stephen opened the folder again, this time removing a single sheet and placing it on top. For the record, he said, the video was scheduled to be included in the original reading. My father's jaw tightened. But, Stephen went on, I was instructed to delay its disclosure. That landed. I looked up then, straight at my father. His eyes didn't meet mine. Not this time. Instructed by whom? Stephen asked aloud, though his gaze never left my father. I don't know what you think you're implying, my father said. We were trying to avoid unnecessary distress. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Stephen didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The recording was nearly removed from the file entirely, he said. It was only preserved because a copy existed outside the primary record. My stomach tightened, but my thoughts sharpened. This wasn't about money. It never had been. This was about control, about shaping the ending after the story was already written. I understood then why that drawer was locked, why the phone calls stopped when I entered rooms, why the paper they wanted me to sign had been presented so casually. They hadn't expected resistance. They'd expected compliance. Stephen looked at me. You haven't heard the recording. No, I said. My voice sounded steady, even to my own ears. He nodded once. Before we proceed, does anyone object to its inclusion? My father opened his mouth. I spoke first. If it exists, I said, keeping my tone level, it should be heard. That was all. No accusation, no history lesson, just a boundary. Stephen didn't hesitate after that. As executor, it's my obligation to present all materials the decedent deemed relevant, he said. We will proceed. My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. A defensive posture I'd seen before. Daniel shifted in his seat. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. Stephen stood and dimmed the light slightly. The screen at the end of the room powered on with a soft hum. No one spoke. No one moved. I felt calm, clear, ready in a way I hadn't been since the funeral. Some truths survive because someone tried to erase them. The screen flickered, and for the first time since the funeral, my father looked afraid. I recognized that look immediately. It was the fear of being seen. My father sat frozen in his chair, the muscles in his jaw twitching as the screen fully came alive. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the speaker. The image sharpened slowly, and there he was, my grandfather, sitting in the brown leather armchair from his study, not slumped or disoriented, upright, present, clear-eyed in a way that made every prior claim about his declining state fall flat. The video began without sound, just a few seconds of stillness, the kind that lets you look someone in the eye long enough to feel the weight of their silence. He adjusted his glasses, laced his fingers together, and looked directly into the camera, into us. Then his voice came through. "If you're watching this," he said, steady and calm, "then I'm no longer able to speak for myself. And knowing some of you, that's exactly when you'd prefer it." No one moved. He continued, "I'm recording this because I suspect there will be a version of the truth presented that leaves too much out, and I want it on record, my words, not theirs." My mother closed her eyes, not like she was bracing for impact, more like she was tired of pretending she hadn't seen it coming. Daniel's spine straightened visibly. His face went blank the way it used to when he was about to lie in school and didn't want to be caught in the details. My grandfather went on, "First, let me be clear. I was of sound mind when I made this recording. Dr. Keller confirmed it that morning. I asked for the exam myself." He held up a folded piece of paper, pointed to the date, and placed it on the side table. That alone was enough to undercut every attempt to discredit what came next. Then he said my name. Michael. Not my grandson. Not the boy. My name. I know they don't say it often, but I'm saying it now. I didn't move. Not because I didn't feel something. On the contrary, I felt everything. My throat tightened, but I stayed still. Dignity matters more than reaction in moments like that. "I remember the mornings you came early to make sure I'd taken my medication," he said. "The afternoons you skipped work to take me to appointments. You never made me feel like a burden. Not once. You stayed when others left." He didn't mention names. He didn't need to. "I made adjustments to my estate," he said, "because I knew what would happen once I was gone. I knew which hands would reach first. And I knew who'd already been slipping money from accounts I hadn't authorized." That line landed like a dropped hammer. My father shifted forward in his seat, opening his mouth, but Stephen raised a hand without looking away from the screen. No interruptions. The screen didn't flinch. My grandfather continued. "A private agreement was made, one that altered the trust's management without my consent. I never signed those revisions, and I instructed my attorney to keep a sealed copy of my original terms." The image cut to a brief close-up of a document. It had my grandfather's signature, a date, a clause referring specifically to oversight of the family's investment accounts, originally meant to include me, then crossed out. My stomach dropped, not from shock, but from confirmation. This wasn't speculation. This was structure. "I don't expect apologies," he said, softer now. "And I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I just want truth where there would have been silence." In the corner of my vision, my father was now sitting stiffly, one hand clenched over the other. Daniel had turned away from the screen slightly, as if it might hurt him to be in its full light. My mother hadn't moved. The lawyer didn't pause the video, didn't react. He simply let it continue. My grandfather took a breath and said, "This recording isn't about who wins. It's about who remembers what was done." No dramatics, no pointed finger, just clarity. That's what made it powerful. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't insult anyone. He simply stated what had happened, knowing full well the weight of his words would fall on the people in that room like lead. That's what truth does when it's been buried too long. It doesn't explode. It crushes. The video ended abruptly. No sign-off, no farewell. The room remained still. No one spoke. Even the air felt reluctant to move. Stephen calmly reached forward and turned off the screen. The lights adjusted themselves back up, but the brightness didn't cut the heaviness that remained. He began organizing papers, methodical and unfazed, a man doing his job, but I sat there, staring at that now blank screen. The video hadn't freed me. It had cornered them. That was when my brother finally spoke. It happened so fast, I almost missed the first words. Daniel leaned forward, hands flat on the polished conference table, and launched into his version like he'd been rehearsing it all morning, maybe longer. That video, it's taken out of context, he said, voice a little too loud for the size of the room. Grandpa was conflicted in the final months. He said a lot of things, some contradictory, some emotional. It doesn't reflect what actually happened. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I'd heard this strategy before, just not this polished. You don't deny the truth. You surround it with enough noise to make it wobble. Stephen, the attorney, didn't react. Neither did I. But the energy in the room shifted again, coiling tighter. Daniel pulled out a folder from the leather briefcase he'd brought. I hadn't noticed it earlier. He slid it across the table, not toward me, but toward Stephen. There's documentation, he said quickly. Agreements, email correspondence, proof that Michael was compensated, informally, for his time with Dad. He knew the terms. He stepped back voluntarily. We all did what we thought was best. My father nodded, arms crossed. It was never hidden. He chose his path. The rest of us carried the load. I looked at my mother. Her face was unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Daniel's eyes met mine. Come on, Mike. You told me yourself you didn't want to be tied to this family mess. You were trying to build your own life. That's why we made the adjustments. He was trying to say it kindly, but there was steel underneath. And a very deliberate word choice. We. I knew then this wasn't improvisation. It was a fallback plan, one designed to activate if the truth ever slipped through. And it just had. My pulse stayed even. Barely. Because if I raised my voice, if I showed even a flicker of outrage, I'd play into the narrative. The angry outsider. The emotional one. The weak link. I couldn't give them that, so I didn't move. Stephen skimmed the documents Daniel had provided. The pages were clean, numbered, stapled, prepared. It didn't matter. I waited. I counted to 3 in my head. Then I leaned forward slightly and asked with deliberate calm, were there any notarized amendments filed after March 18th, specifically with regard to the trust's primary oversight? Stephen paused mid-flip. That pause, that was the crack. He looked up. There was one, filed March 29th. My brother's eyes darted left. I continued, keeping my tone neutral. And was I included in that filing? Stephen cleared his throat. Yes, you were reinstated as joint fiduciary, as per your grandfather's instruction. The room didn't explode. It collapsed inward. Daniel's jaw moved, but no sound came out. My father turned toward him, not whispering, not yelling, just sharp enough to hear, "You said it was handled." I thought it was voided, Daniel muttered, glancing down at the briefcase like it might save him. I told them not to. You told who? I asked. He didn't answer. Stephen laid the March 29th amendment flat on the table. This supersedes any earlier claims of informal arrangements. It's signed, dated, and notarized, and legally binding. Silence returned, but it wasn't quiet. It was loaded. I could have driven the point home. I could have called them liars, manipulators. I could have stood up and demanded they admit what they tried to do. Instead, I took a slow breath and said, "Given the irregularities, I'd like to request a full forensic review of all asset transfers and document revisions made within the past year, and I want independent oversight, not family." Stephen didn't blink. "That's a reasonable request." My father leaned back like he'd been punched. Daniel put both hands under the table. My mother still hadn't moved. The meeting ended not with a conclusion, but with exhaustion. Stephen began collecting papers again, this time with more care. "I'll arrange for an independent auditor. You'll all be contacted by the end of the week." Nobody objected. Daniel rose first, slowly, like his legs didn't quite trust the floor. My father followed, stiff, silent, jaw set. As they moved toward the door, I caught something in Daniel's face I hadn't seen before. It wasn't resentment, it was fear. As they stood to leave, I understood that winning had just made everything more dangerous. I didn't walk out feeling victorious. I walked out knowing the truth had a price. They filed out of the conference room in a staggered hush. My father first, still stiff with the weight of a story he couldn't control. My brother trailing behind, not saying a word, eyes unfocused. My mother lingered, as if she wanted to say something but had forgotten how. I didn't wait for her to find the words. I just nodded once, stood, and left. Weeks passed. Quietly. There were no dramatic phone calls, no letters begging for reconciliation, no long overdue apologies scribbled at midnight. Instead, silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the kind that protected secrets. It was the sound that came after a storm had wrecked the landscape, when people start pretending they hadn't been the ones holding the match. Everything went through the attorneys now. Every update, every asset inventory, every line item on the estate's distribution. It was impersonal, factual, and dry. And maybe that was a gift. After so many years of emotional gymnastics, this kind of clarity felt like mercy. I learned the final allocation by email. Daniel would retain part of the estate, some properties, a trust that had been originally intended for him and hadn't been touched during the conflict. But several key assets, especially those tied to the original family business, were moved under new oversight. Not to me, not directly. They were placed in a managed trust with rotating auditors. I didn't get everything, but I got what mattered. I didn't ask for vengeance. I asked for the record to be set straight, and it had been. Not in a way that humiliated them, just in a way that prevented it from happening again. That's what justice often looks like, small, quiet corrections that no one cheers for. My mother called me once, just once. The phone lit up one evening while I was washing dishes. I let it ring 3 times before answering. She asked how I was. I said I was fine. She didn't say she missed me. I didn't ask why she stayed quiet in that room. There was a pause between us, long and familiar. Then she said, "Your grandfather loved you. You know that, right?" "I do now," I replied. That was it. She didn't call again. Weeks later, I drove back to my grandfather's house. It had been cleaned out by then, mostly. The furniture was covered. The shelves were bare. The smell of his pipe tobacco had finally faded, but the chair was still there. That same old wooden chair by the window, the one he always claimed had just the right lean. Morning light slanted through the glass exactly as it had so many times before, falling across the faded rug in a quiet, deliberate line. I sat down. The cushion gave slightly beneath me, like it remembered. I didn't think of the courtroom, or the fights, or the inheritance. I thought of the way he used to hum under his breath when he read the Sunday paper. I thought of how he'd pause in mid-sentence when he heard birdsong, as if he wanted to let the world speak instead. I thought of the conversations we never had and the ones we did, the ones that changed everything, even if they seemed small at the time. He gave me more than a name on a document. He gave me clarity. He gave me a way out of the shadow I'd been dragging behind me for years. I used to think I needed my family to recognize me to feel whole, but sitting in that chair, in the house he once filled with decency and silence that meant safety, not manipulation, I realized something else. I didn't need their approval anymore. What I needed, he already gave me. The truth. His truth. My truth. Some wounds stay open. They stop bleeding, but they never quite close. That's okay. Pain isn't the enemy. The lie that it was ever deserved, that's what keeps people trapped. I define family differently now. Family isn't just blood. It's not paperwork. It's not shared houses or last names. It's the people who see you clearly and still choose not to look away. That list is smaller than I'd like, but it's real. If you've listened to this story, maybe you recognize pieces of it in your own life. Maybe you've stood in a room where no one told the truth and wondered if it was you who didn't belong. Maybe you felt that being right didn't feel like winning. And maybe, just maybe, you've learned that silence is not always kindness. This story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting even. It was about stepping into the light with your name intact, even when others would rather you stayed in the dark. I didn't inherit a fortune, but I inherited my name back.